webinar. I'm Susan O'Hara, and I'm presenting this webinar today on behalf of Charlesworth Author Services. And we're just waiting for all of our attendees to join us today. So we'll give it about another minute, but I just want to take some time to thank you for being here. We appreciate your attendance. And while we're waiting, for those of you who this is your first webinar in the series, I just want to tell you a little bit about Charlesworth Author Services. Charlesworth Author Services is a leading editorial services, publication support, and author training provider, and you're a trusted partner in the global academic community for over 90 years. And Charlesworth can help you with every step of your publishing and grant writing journey. You can get research papers edited for English language, style, and structure by native English-speaking subject specialist editors, which will improve your chances of publication. And there's also a large range of publication support services that are offered: plagiarism checks, grant editing, which is important as we talk about content today, video abstracts, help with journal selection. So visit the website at cwauthors.com and you can find out more about the services. And if you find this webinar or any of the other Charlesworth webinars or services useful and informative, you can also reach out to one of our Charlesworth publishing team who can help give you more information about the services we provide. And here are just some of the publishing companies that recommend Charlesworth Author Services. So if you submit an article to one of these publishing companies, chances are they will recommend the excellent Charlesworth Services. So just so you know, it's well used and well recommended. So I'm going to go ahead and start today's webinar. And the webinar today is focusing on the grant proposal writing process, and really on how to write competitive grants to get your research funded. And this grant writing webinar is going to be in 3 parts. So in part 1, we will look at unpacking a request for proposal, and we'll talk about what that is and what to look for in that, and choosing the right funder. In part 2, we'll talk about how do you actually put together the proposal and the budget and the grant packet that goes as part of your application submission. And then in the 3rd part of the webinar, we'll talk about managing time, because this grant proposal process has many parts and it's time consuming. And then also what happens when you get a notification. So how do you resubmit it if you're asked to make some revisions, or how do you process the award? So let's look at part 1, and we're going to start by looking at the process of grant writing and what does that look like. What steps you take during the grant writing process. So you start with a research focus based on your area of interest and your area of research, and this research focus should be new or innovative, and also generate new scientific knowledge for the field. So funders are interested in those proposals that are going to advance your field in some way, and those that are new or innovative. So you want to figure out what that is, and then you want to be able to find funding so that you can support your research project. And so you search for a prospective funder, and you can look to private and public funders, and we'll talk about that today. But once you've found the funder, you may find a request for proposals. So some granting agencies put out a request for proposals annually, biannually, every few years, and you have a specific date to submit by. Or some funders, you submit a letter of inquiry and tell them a little bit about your study, and then if they're interested, they invite you to submit a packet. And then in the next stage, once you've chosen a funder, you're ready to look at their grant application package and put together your proposal for submission. And you really need to understand, and this will come up many times today, all of their requirements. So you prepare a narrative and a budget and other forms and components of the grant package. And many academics and researchers spend 6 to 8 months preparing grant proposals, so it's a time-consuming process. And many of these, for example, the National Science Foundation, have a very detailed and complex grant application package process. So you need to make sure you understand the complexity of the proposal and allocate enough time to get it ready and submit. And once you've gone through and have your proposal developed and all the pieces that you get it back and they give you the funding, and then you conduct the work and submit reports. Or else what we'll also talk about today is sometimes they encourage you to reapply for funding based on some revisions they'd like to see. So let's talk now about the components of a grant proposal. Generally, you will have a title page and cover letter. And then you would have an introduction, abstract and summary, institutional background, a problem statement, and maybe a needs assessment. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Program goals and objectives, what you're trying to do. Your methods and implementation plans, so what methods you'll use and how you're going to conduct the work. You might have an evaluation plan, and we'll talk about that in a moment here too. And then any sustainability, how is this work or this research going to sustain and grow over time? So the strong problem statement needs to be included in your proposal, and a needs assessment sometimes to show the need for your study or intervention. You want to show the funder that you fully understand research that's already been conducted in this area, and that this new study will make a contribution to the field and generate new knowledge by either filling a gap that exists or moving the field forward. Now, for some types of research, especially in the social sciences, for example, you might have an intervention or a program that you're putting in place. So for example, maybe you have a program that reduces stress and anxiety among young adults, and your grant is to look at that program and see the outcomes of that program. If that's the case, you want also a needs assessment. So beyond a problem statement that shows you understand the research that's already been conducted and shows how your research is going to move the field forward, you might need a needs assessment that says that in the particular area that you're working in, this group of subjects that will be part of your grant have a need for this. So that would be a needs assessment included in your grant. You need to be able to articulate how your proposal is going to achieve its goals and aims. So basically, you want to be able to answer the question for the reviewers. What will be true at the end of this grant that would not be true if the study was not conducted? And why is the proposal worth funding? Those are two major things that funders look to. They want to fund something that couldn't happen without this study and that they feel is worth funding based on their priorities. For your methods, you want them to be detailed, and your implementation plan, and these would be even more detailed in a grant proposal than, say, you would include in a research paper. So funders really want to see your methods sections strong and rigorous. They want to see things like selection of sample size and how that was done. They want to see if you calculated the power of your study. They want to see all the statistical tests you're using, all of the instruments that you're using and measures, reliability and validity information for them. And this part of the grant is weighted very heavily normally, so it's very important that this be robust and reflect the expertise on the grant and be achievable. So it's important to note that a funder will look to see, do the people who are principal investigators or researchers on this grant have the right expertise for the methods that are in the grant. So you want to make sure that that is true. And then your implementation plan should be viable, feasible, and attainable with the resources you are asking for. So you could come up with a Cadillac version of an implementation plan, but it has to fit with the funding and resources that you're asking for. Or the funder will say, well, this is a really great plan, but there's no way you can achieve this or implement this plan given the resources that are coming to you. So that's really important too. And then finally, most funders want to know that if you're testing a program and evaluating it, and that's your grant, some intervention, that this has sustainability beyond just research funding. Or they want to know that where future funding might come to for this research area to grow out. So you want to put in about future funding and sustainability so the funder sees that. So then now that you've understood these elements of what would be in a grant proposal, you've identified a funder and you have the request for proposals. Most government funding agencies put out a request for proposals. And it's a complicated document, and you need to be able to unpack it because you really need to understand every aspect of what this request for proposals includes before you start writing. The request for proposals outlines the grant review process. So when you look at the request for proposals, you'll be able to understand how the grant will be reviewed. You'll be able to know the terms and conditions of the grant, any requirements you have to meet. And requirements can mean things like how long, how many pages do you have? How many, can you include appendices, or do they count in the proposal page count? Do you need letters of support from partners? All of these types of things. In addition, for example, some funders might require matching funds. So they might say, well, we'll give you 80% of the money if you can show that you have some other source that will give you 20% of the money. And if they do require matching funds, then you would have to document how you're going to secure those. So there's a lot of pieces to a grant application, and that's why reading the request for proposals is really important, because it will explain and outline all of those. The RFP will explain how the proposal should be structured and formatted and what it should include. So you pay close attention to all of these requirements. You read the RFP very, very carefully and just make sure you understand everything. And if there's a time you don't, you can always reach out and call a program officer with the funder or somebody with the funder and ask. If you submit a proposal that doesn't meet all of their requirements, they can decide not to review it. And this happens where they say, no, this doesn't meet all of the requirements. We're not even going to put it out for review. And because it's past the deadline, you'd have to wait a whole other year perhaps before you could submit again. The RFP will outline how the proposal will be assessed. So you'll know how the different components will be weighted in review. And it will also then, if you look at the RFP, it'll give you the history of the organization which is funding, a detailed description of the focus. It usually includes the reason why they're putting out this call and what their priorities are. But you can also explore the funder website to understand their priorities in more detail. And when you write your proposal, it should be in direct response to this RFP. So you should only write the proposal in direct response to what they ask for, not additional information or detail. And then they will tell you in the RFP how much the award is for. And so it's important, if you know anyone who has successfully submitted a grant to this funder, talk to them about their experiences. If you know anyone who has served as a reader or reviewer for that grant program, talk to them too. These people can also give you insight into the RFP as you unpack it. So the other thing is that most funding agencies, when they put out an RFP, usually have a frequently asked questions portion on their website. And these include all the questions that they get in that potential applicants are asking and answers to those questions. So it's good to look at this. It gives you a lot of additional information if there are aspects of the RFP that are unclear. And these questions and answers can range from applicant eligibility to issues that they prioritize with evaluation, to any budget questions. So there's a lot of them. So I think browsing them, I think as someone who's submitted grants, I've always found it really, really good to browse those questions and answers. And I just put up an example link here to one that's put out by the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, but that's just as an example. So here you can get a checklist of the things that you can use as you're going through the RFP. And this can guide you as you unpack the RFP. Yeah, the RFP, you know, you should pick out the name of the grant program because you're going to have to include that on a lot of the documents that you prepare as part of the grant application packet. Deadline for application is really key, right? You have to know when that is. How much funding they will award, what the grant guidelines are, who is the key contact person, because at many times you most likely will have questions and it is perfectly fine to reach out to their key contact and ask. Are you eligible for funding? Is the funding available in your geographical area? Is there a need that you can clearly meet? And can you conduct your project for the amount of funding available? So these are just some key things and checklists to think about as you go through. Make sure that you have an understanding of all of these, having unpacked the RFP. So I'll give you just a sec to look at those. And that checklist is a good checklist to have with you as you're going through and preparing your application and making sure you've understood all of that from the packet. So now we come to identifying a funder. So when you're starting off, right, you want to find a funder, either a private or a public funder, so that you can submit an application and so you can secure funding for your research. And so these are some things to think about. So when you're thinking about finding a funder, you want to identify your own funding needs. What is your statement of need? What is the amount of funding you need? And so as an example, if you're looking for a small research project to help you launch your research agenda, and you're at the beginning, early career, and you don't need a large grant, you can often look to private funders to help do that. And so sometimes there are private funders who will give small amounts for a smaller program. In addition, depending on the institution that you're at, institutions often give out grants and funding to early career researchers. And even some of the big funding agencies, like in the United States, give out small grants to early career researchers. So if you're beginning and it's a small project, then maybe you don't need a large funder, but you need a small grant to get you started. Then you want to identify search criteria. So develop a comprehensive search criteria list so you can refine and focus your search quickly as you're looking for funders. And identify just some keywords and phrases that you'll use that align with your topic of interest to search for suitable grant opportunity. And then you can research some primary sources of funding. So maybe use your search criteria to find 5 public sector funding opportunities. So these could be at the government level, These could be things like grants.gov in the US, or the EU Commission puts out funding opportunities. So you look for 5 potential public sector grants that you might apply to. And then you can also research private sources of funding. So use your search criteria to find 5 potential funding opportunities in the private sector. And these can be foundations and corporations. At many institutions, they have an Office of Sponsored Research or a Research and Grants Office. And they also have what are called development offices, so offices that work with private corporations and funders. Finding out where these offices are and making a connection with them is really key if you do that at your institution, because they can let you know of both private and public funding sources and potential grants. And in addition to that, at some institutions, your development office will actually help you prepare an application to a private sector, either a foundation or a corporation. So it's good to know who those are. And so then, once you have a list of some public and private granting funders or potential funders, you kind of have a list of things you ask yourself to identify if the funding sources are right for you. Always look to see, is the opportunity still open? Are they still funding that program? How much are they given to your subject area? So what amount is the funding? Does that make sense for what you're trying to do? Who else are they funding? Find out what other kinds of projects they've funded. Most large funding agencies will put up examples of projects that have been funded, and you can read what those are. So does that sound about right for the kind of project that you're doing? How can you apply? Is your mission compatible with theirs? Is the aim of your research something that's compatible with what the agency is doing? So for example, in education, you might be interested in doing research on how at-risk students can be researched to achieve academic outcomes. And that might be something where you look for a foundation that really serves at-risk students, and that's where you would apply for your funding. Does the program help solve a problem they're passionate about? Do you help people the funder cares about? Are the subjects of your research or the outcomes of your research relevant for people the funder cares about? And make sure always that you know the funder actually funds in your geographic area, and that should be easy to find on funders' websites. And then you would create a short list once you've identified which of the funding sources you have found that are right for you. Create a short list of your top 3. So you started out with 10, then you went down and did some more searching. Now know what your top 3 are. And then visit their websites. Get to know each funder, visit their website, look at their annual reports, read the success stories of previous grants, look at staff biographies, and then decide who you're going to reach out to first. Do they have a request for proposals and a specific date when you can apply for grant funding? Or do you need to submit a letter of inquiry and follow up with them in that way, which is usually true for most foundations and corporations. And then if needed, request to submit an application and submit that letter of inquiry. One other way to find funders is to use databases to look for funding opportunities. So grants.gov is one that lists funding opportunities in the United States. And they do, many of those funders that are listed in grants.gov do fund international projects. The Federal Registry is another one I put up here as the screenshot, the European Commission, which posts out funding opportunities in research and innovation. So you can look to those. And then some guides for actually searching. You want to brain list 10 or more keywords. If you're using one of these databases, you definitely want to go in with some words related to your subject area. You want to search around or filter by your geographic area and your target audience. And we at Charlesworth do provide more articles and blogs that give some more detailed information about how to do these searches and how to conduct some of these searches. So that's really the big picture of unpacking the RFP and finding your funder. And again, I can't overemphasize the need to really look and understand the resources that exist at your institution to help you identify where those funders are, because there are so many out there. And if there are not, there's not an office of research, or there is not a development office that really provides that support for researchers at your institution, reach out to a mentor, more senior academics and researchers, reach out to people at your professional organizations that you're part of. Try to get as much information from people you know professionally who are doing similar research about the best places to apply. So now we're going to talk about structuring the proposal and then developing a grant budget. So let's talk about the components of a grant proposal. And I'm going to start off by saying a grant proposal is got many more parts than a research paper. And so it can be very time consuming, and there can be many forms and things to fill out, but here are the main components. You need usually a title page and cover letter, and then you'll have a brief overview of the proposal with information about the institution, its ability to complete the project, the need for the project, methods to be used, and how those served will benefit. And that will be in your introduction, abstract, or summary. And that's the first thing the reader sees. And that's the one that you really want to emphasize the importance of your study in that part. In your institutional background, you'll describe the institution in terms of its location, demographics, the mission of your institution, the relationship that the institution has to the service area, past successes with the research, also the research support and resources that you are provided. So that could mean lab support, for example, if you are doing some kind of scientific research. That could mean the availability of graduate students and postdocs to be part of the research study, all of those things. And then with the problem statement, you're going to document the problem or need with hard data, linking it to funding sources, goals, and priorities. What's the situation that is causing a need for this? And then how are you going to address it? And in the program goals and objectives, you'll identify the anticipated outcomes and benefits of your project and how those will be measured. How are those goals going to be measured? How is the situation then expected to change as the result of a grant program, if it's an intervention or a program, or what will the outcomes be if it's a research study? You'll describe the methods, as we talked about, a rigorous method section, as well as a very detailed implementation plan. And usually you'll have a timeline, which we'll talk about in a moment, that will be included in this section as well, and a description of the staffing that you will need for this project. And then if you need an evaluation plan that really shows how you're going to determine the success of a project at interim points and at the end, you would include that. It's not always required, and for many research studies it's not, but for some types of research, more in the social sciences, it can be required. Then you'll describe how expenses not supported by the grant will be covered. And so there are always what we will call direct costs, and I'll talk about these in a moment, and indirect costs. And so the direct costs are being paid by the granting agency or the funder, but there are indirect costs, like your office space, for example, or a lab if you need to use a lab. And the costs of those things are usually supported by your institution, but you want to talk about those. And then you want to identify the costs to be met by the funding source And then there may be other components too that they'll ask for, like letters of support. They always ask for personnel resumes. So there's lots of different things that you will need to include in this packet. The other thing about this that's really important to remember is that once your grant application packet has been completed, you always have to have an institutional review of the packet before it's officially submitted. So even though you're a researcher and you're working at a university or an institution, it's the institution that's submitting the grant, not you. So you do all of this work, you create this packet, you come up with the preliminary budget, but your institution has to review that, make sure it fiscally makes sense, make sure it's in compliance with the research rules they're required to be in compliance with, and that it's actually feasible. And they also make sure that nothing's promised in the grant on behalf of the institution that the institution cannot support. So usually it takes them anywhere from 1 week to 2 weeks at your institution to review your grant before you submit it. So you need to be ready with everything in advance of that. So here are some of the pre-proposal tasks that are part of the grant writing process. We've talked about you download the request for proposal guidelines and you study them carefully. There may be specific evaluation criteria that you have to attend to. Then you're going to define the problem and the need. So you think about the purpose of your proposal, and then you answer the following questions. What do you want to accomplish? Why do you want to accomplish this? Why is it important? And how are you going to accomplish it? Because that's basically what your grant is going to tell the funder. They're going to tell you what you want to accomplish, why you want to accomplish it, why it's important, and how you're going to accomplish it. And then the more you know about who's reviewing your proposal, the better. So again, this can be talking to other people who understand this grant program, making sure you understand what the funder says about the criteria that would be used to assess the grant or review the grant, looking at their website, definitely talking to anybody if you know them who served as a reviewer for that grant program. And then you'll conduct a gap analysis to assess what the current situation is so that you can articulate what's going to be different as a result of your study that wouldn't be different otherwise. And that can mean I'm going to implement this program and evaluate it, and that's what I'm getting grant funding for. And all of these kids and this system will have built capacity to do a better job in the future as a result of that. Or it can mean I'm going to conduct a research study, and then as a result of my research study, there's going to be new knowledge for the field that's going to help move the field forward. And then you want to plan your proposal, obviously, and we'll talk about that. We talked about the components of a proposal, so it's all in distinct sections, so you want to make sure you have a plan for that and choose the title. So these pre-proposal tasks are just important to attend to. Project timelines are really, really important. It's very important to have a very detailed project timeline. I know, as serving as a reader and a reviewer for a number of large grant programs, that being able to see that the researcher can really communicate the tasks that will happen as part of the grant and when they will happen over time, that makes a reviewer and a funder feel very confident in that researcher's ability to really understand and implement the grant program. So it really increases the chances of a successful grant proposal because it shows reviewers you've planned out all aspects of the grant and the work is achievable within the time. And so to do this, you determine the amount of time available under the grant, You just divide that time for each 12-month period into quarters. So really, if you had a 3-year grant and it started in August of 2021, then you take the 2021 to 2022 time period and divide it up into quarters. And then you actually just list everything that will take place during that full grant period. So no matter what it is, you list out all the things that will take place. And remember to include time for items such as award acceptance. So once you get the award, you generally can't just start the work that day. You've got to process the award at your institution. And you've also got to have meetings with your partners. Maybe you have to develop some instruments still. So all of the things that have to happen before the actual research project can begin, you want to include time for those. And then you list all major events and activities that are part of the grant, and you include those. And any major meetings. So for many grants, you'll have an advisory board, you'll have partners, you'll have a research team. So there's meetings that have to happen, and the funders want to see that you have a plan for keeping all of these people informed throughout the course of your grant. So the project timeline is really important. And then last, but not at all least, are the reporting requirements and due dates. So most funding agencies have specifically articulated reporting requirements and due dates. And most of them ask for interim, informal quarterly reports and then an annual report. So you want to have included all the report pieces into your timeline. So now we come to tips for writing the proposal. And as I said at the beginning, strong grant proposals take a long time to develop. So you want to start the process early and leave time to get feedback from several readers on different drafts. And as I mentioned at the beginning, academics often take 6 to 8 months, if not more, to write a grant proposal and pull it together. So begin early. Don't forget to include a cover letter with your application. Answer all questions. RFPs will often pose questions for you to follow, so you want to answer all their questions. Follow the application guidelines exactly. Be explicit, clear, and compelling. Be realistic in designing the project. So don't try to say, oh, I'm going to do this fabulous project, because that will be more competitive. If it doesn't realistically seem to fit with the resources you're given, then that will not be a competitive grant proposal. So you need to be realistic. Make explicit the connections between your research questions and objectives, your objectives and methods, your methods and results, and your results and dissemination plan. So all the pieces that go across your grant, you want to be sure that when you pose research questions, I can see how those relate to the objectives and goals of the grant, how your methods are helping you answer the research questions, and how you also have a dissemination plan for after the grant, how you will get the research out there. Get feedback on the proposal and revise often. And if rejected, which happens many, many times, revise your proposal, look at reviewers' comments, and apply again. So when you're actually putting together your proposal, you want to ask yourself, have you presented a compelling case? Have you made your hypothesis explicit? Does your project seem feasible? Is it overly ambitious? That's a thing, as I mentioned this earlier, that funders will say that's too ambitious. Does it have other weaknesses? Have you stated the means that grantors can use to evaluate the success of your project after you've executed it? So these are all important things. And remember to look to any particular criteria that the funder lists that they use for rating and evaluating proposals. So then your checklist, you want to make sure that you have your proposal, your work plan, description of all the key personnel on the grant, your budget, and then a research or an evaluation plan, depending on the type of grant that you're applying for. So let's talk a little bit about the budget. Budgets include direct costs and indirect costs. So the direct costs are things like the salary for those people who will be working on the grant, and that has to always include salary and benefits, right? Because That's a part of what they're compensated. Travel, equipment and supplies, participant stipends, if there's stipends for people participating in the grant. When you read the RFP for the grant, you make sure that you know what costs are allowable. So I'll give you an example. For certain grants that you apply for, if you're doing a research study, they don't include administrative support for that because they expect that your institution is supposed to include that as a part of their indirect costs. So if you're saying I'm going to have somebody who's going to run copies or type things up for me and help in that way, usually that cost is not allowable in many public sector grants. So you have to make sure you know what's an allowable cost and what's not. And it's not always easy to tell from the RFP. So the best advice is that's a great area to have a conversation with your program officer and just make sure when you have a preliminary budget that those costs are covered. And then indirect costs include like operating costs and support services that your organization provides. So there's usually a rate called a facilities and administration rate that's applied to grants, and it can go anywhere from 15% to 60% at some universities, and that's the indirect cost amount. So when you submit your budget for $2 million, if you had a 50% F&A rate, that would mean 50% of the money, $1 million, would go to your institution for organizational support, and $1 million would go to your research team to conduct the grant. So you need to talk to your research office at your institution so you understand what that rate is for different grants. That way, when you're budgeting out what you need to do the grant, you know how much of the funding you actually get, because you don't get it all for the research. A portion of it goes to your institution to cover indirect costs. So it's really important to know that. And then you'll have a budget and a budget narrative. So as well as listing out all the items in your budget, you also have to list out a justification for why they're needed for the grant. And that's a really important thing not to miss. It's really important that you have that budget, everything that will be in the grant, how much it costs, as well as a justification for that. So if I'm going to ask for funding for a piece of equipment, I have to justify why that's needed in the grant. And your university or your institution have to justify the indirect rate that they're charging as well. So I just put up here an example of what the National Institutes of Health in the US ask for example, in their budget. They have budget forms, detailed budget forms. And typically in my experience, most grant offices at your university help you fill out these budget forms. So oftentimes the researcher will come up with the budget of what they think they need in Excel or some other format, sit down with someone in the grants office at your institution, and then say, how do I need to give you this so you can populate the form that the funder asks for. That's often the way that it happens because the institution has to be very careful around the fiscal part of your grant. So they usually are involved in that. And then you'll see NIH example once, if you have personnel, they want to know how much effort is being put into this grant in months. So maybe as the principal investigator, I'm going to say 3 of 12 months effort will be dedicated for this. They'll want to know all the costs of equipment, travel, trainee, other direct costs, indirect costs. So if you go to this link that's here, you can see exactly what this is. And we do have an article through Charlesworth that really in more detail outlines how to approach the preparation of your budget for a grant application. And this is what that form looks like for the NIH, just one part of it. It's usually quite long. So again, I can't overemphasize, You're trying to write the intellectual part of the grant, which in and of itself is a lot. You're trying to manage any partners, letters of support. Do I need an advisory board? All the pieces that you need to pull together for this grant application. So rely on your budget office to help with the pieces that are related to the budget and the fiscal part of your grant. So now we're just going to talk about some guidelines. Use the budget guidelines and or the specific budget forms provided by the funder, definitely. Your research and grants office should offer support in helping develop the budget and enter the budget into any required form. Understand the expectation of the funder and be as cost effective as is reasonable, because they look for that in the review. Generate what your recurring and non-recurring expenses are. Examine the budget justifications for other grant proposals to help develop a clear and detailed justification. Yeah, justifications are almost like template form. So if you're applying to the National Science Foundation, for example, for a grant, the justifications look pretty similar across grants. So having someone else who's applied say, can you just show me how you wrote your justification for each budget item? What did that look like? That can really help you in developing yours. So in the last 5 minutes or so that we have, I just want to talk about these last things about processing the award and then maybe resubmitting it. So if you're not awarded, don't despair. Many strong proposals are not awarded funds on their first submission. I know many top researchers at many institutions who were 2 or 3 rounds of applying for certain grants around certain research before they got big funding. So that's why it's always good too, if you can look for a little bit of funding to get you started to do a pilot study so that you have data going into a bigger funding. That also helps make you more competitive. If you get reviews back, read the reviews very carefully. If you're not funded, talk with the program officer assigned to your proposal. Ask what you should emphasize in a resubmission. And then make a comprehensive list of the reviewer's comments and suggestions and use this as a guide to rewrite the proposal. So again, if you're asked to rewrite it, you'll have usually a year, maybe 6 months, depending if they fund annually or they fund twice a year, but you have some time. So take those comments, go through, revise what you need to revise. Maybe you need to get some additional pilot data and do some more research before you can apply again. And then always look to people who are more knowledgeable, more senior researchers in the field to help you through that process. So after you get the award, you have to process it. So you review the award letter and you make sure all the information is accurate and how much money you were awarded. You're not always awarded what you asked for, so make sure you understand how much was awarded to you. Then make sure you understand the institutional process at your institution for processing that. Because your institution has to process the letter and they have to set up an account for your grant, and then they have to get the money in from the funder. And so it's coming again to the institution. So you have to let your research and grant support office know that you got the award letter, and they will work with you as they set up the accounts. You may have to apply for institutional review boards. So for any research that has human subjects, you need an ethics board approval to do that. Sometimes people, oftentimes they will apply for it when they're submitting the grant or shortly after the grant, so they have it in case they're given the award. Sometimes that doesn't happen, but know that that can take 6 to 8 weeks for the review to be processed. So you should start that review right away after you get the award if you haven't already done so. And make sure you know when all of the reports are due to the funder, and that you attend any webinars or training, which they always put out on how to put together your report, because they ask for very specific things. Review your timeline and revise if necessary. The grant funding doesn't always come when you expect it. The review process can be delayed. So you might have to shift your start date. You might have to talk to partners if you're working with them. So make sure that you have all of that done. And then obviously communicate the news to any stakeholders, anybody involved in the grant. And then here are some of the guidelines or suggestions for managing your grant. Understand all requirements. Make sure that you have a structure for storing confidential data. Data confidentiality is huge. You need to have a really strong plan for how you're making sure your data is confidentially stored. You develop a relationship with your program officer because they'll be talking back and forth with you around reports that are due. Attend all webinars by the funder gives on reporting. Record every penny spent so you have a system in place to manage all expenditures and work with your budget office on that. And plan regular grant meetings that include both your budget office, but then also meetings to include any of your research team. So with that, we've sort of gone through the whole grant writing process, all the pieces that are involved, and we are finished with that part. What I will say is that we do give a discount, just so you know, off Charlesworth author services. And so you can put the code in webinar G9 if you go to cwauthors.com, and that's valid until the end of December 2021. And I would say if anyone now has any questions that they have, I'll give you a few moments based on what you've heard in this webinar today. Any questions you'd like answered, please just type them into the questions part of your control panel. So your GoToWebinar control panel has a question part. If you type questions in there, I'll be more than happy to answer them now. And if we don't have time for all questions, we also send out answers afterwards to any questions that didn't get answered. Just in terms of, while I'm waiting and you can type your questions in, but just in terms of the institutional review or the ethics review, understanding that process is really, really key. And so any research, as I said, that involves human subjects means you have to go through an institutional review board application process. And because that takes 6 to 8 weeks, my advice always to people is to try and do that when you submit the grant so that you can have approval if the grant's awarded. Or if you submit a grant to a very large granting agency, which can take somewhere, can take anywhere from 6 to 8 months for the review process before you even hear anything at all back from them, then, plan to put in an application to your ethics review board for your study 3 months before you're thinking you might hear back about the grant. What happens sometimes is you hear back about the grant, you're awarded, and then you put in the review proposal, and then you can't actually start the research study till that's approved, and you could be waiting 2 months, and sometimes a little longer depending on the institution. So then that sort of delays you starting your actual research project. So whenever possible, do make sure you ask at your institution what that process is, and then get that application in shortly after your grant. And then just in terms of the grant application process itself, and some pitfalls that you can avoid, some of the areas that I think where people are not as competitive in writing a grant proposal, sometimes it's because they haven't identified the appropriate grant program for their application. So again, it's good to get advice and input, either from research office on your campus or other researchers you work with or a professional organization you're with. Get their input on whether or not your funder seems like the right fit for you, because the worst thing is to develop a whole grant application submitted and find that, well, it's not a good fit. And I would advise that if you're not completely sure it's a good fit, reach out to the program officer in advance of submitting an application and just say, does this seem like it might be a good fit for this grant program? Also, fully understanding the requirements, that's another thing. You put all this months of effort in, you submit your grant application, and then because the requirements of the grant weren't met, they don't review your application. That's really heartbreaking after all that intellectual work. So do make sure you understand the requirements and you've met all of those. And then, as always, I think this is true for all aspects of work as researchers and academics, ask for collaborator input, feedback to ensure it's competitive as possible. And if you are starting off as an early career researcher, then my advice is to see if you can become part of a collaborative grant opportunity with a smaller role than the main researcher, to just experience the process of a grant application with more senior researchers. That's some of the best experience you can get. So if you can become a part of that as a co-principal investigator and be on a grant proposal that's led by somebody else who's done this before, that's a great experience. And then the last thing that I will say then is allocate enough time to attend to all of the moving parts. There are many moving parts in a grant application process. And so you want to make sure that you've really thought them all through in advance and allocated the time so that you don't get pulled off filling out forms at a time when you really need to be intellectually focusing on the content of your proposal. So with that, if there are not any more questions, I think that brings us to the end of our webinar today. Of course, if you have any questions beyond this, please feel free to reach out and contact Charlesworth, and we will be very happy to provide you with any information. And just thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you attending this webinar.